All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Matthias Stangl. I'm an assistant professor here at Boston University. And yeah, together with this really amazing team that Swati already introduced, it's been my huge pleasure to organize this conference. And as Swati said, the response to this conference has been absolutely incredible from all different sides, like speakers, audience, poster submissions, everything. And I personally think this is just a really powerful and strong testament for how important and how exciting it is to study the human brain during everyday life activities. And to kick off this exciting program, we think that we found the perfect person to really kind of open our minds to this frontier. And so it is my huge pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Hugo Spiers. Hugo is a professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Experimental Psychology at University College London in the UK. He's also a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation, and he is director of the International Center for Neuroarchitecture and Neurodesign. His work is at the very heart of our conference theme, exploring the fundamental question of how our brain constructs representations of the world to recall our past, navigate the present, and imagine the future. His path began with doctoral work at UCL in the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience under Neil Burgess and Nobel laureate John O'Keefe. After postdoctoral fellowships with Kim Graham in Cambridge and Eleanor McGuire at the Wellcome Trust Center, he then established the UCL Spatial Cognition Lab in 2010, which he continues to lead today. But that is only his official biography. So if you follow science of social media, you may already know quite a bit about Hugo's work, because it feels to me like every few weeks there is another headline about one of his groundbreaking discoveries, all the way from how the layout of your hometown shapes your kind of sense of direction, or how people all across the world, from London taxi drivers to sailors in the Marshall Islands, find their way and manage not to get lost. I was personally very excited to have the chance to introduce Hugo today, as my own work is strongly related to and also very much inspired by your amazing research. Although I will admit there are a few obvious differences. For instance, my recent study had a sample size of 5 people, whereas Hugo works with sample sizes of more 500,000, if I'm right. So yeah, very exciting, but as it turns out, Hugo was also a reviewer on our recent work, so publicly thank you for letting that through. So yeah, in short, I truly cannot imagine a better person to open this conference today. Hugo embodies the spirit of curiosity, rigor, and large-scale thinking that I think really pushes this field forward. And so I hope you all look forward to his talk as much as I do, and yeah, please join me in welcoming Hugo today.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Yeah, the mic's on me now. That's the nicest introduction I've had in my whole career, 25 years, I think. So thank you very much, Matthias. And it's a real pleasure to be here talking to this audience here, and particularly all the trainees who are new to learning about these methods. My title of today is Studying Navigation in Cities and on the Ocean. Most of my talk is going to be about cities, where we are now, like a city like Boston. I'll start a bit in the ocean, in a virtual ocean, and we'll come back at the end to research on the actual ocean, where we'll be going after this. But I'd like to start today's talk by thanking my previous mentor that Matthias mentioned, Eleanor McGuire, Professor of Neuroscience at University College London, and a fellow of the Royal Society. She sadly passed away on the 4th of January this year, fighting for several years with spinal cancer. So very sad. We've all been very saddened by her loss in London. And she's famous for discovering that the brains of London taxi drivers are larger in their posterior hippocampus. She was awarded the Ig Nobel Prize for that, which is this quirky work that could win a Nobel kind of story. So we're very sad, but also I want to look at her in this talk and think, I still smile because I think she was a very funny person. She was a great witty sense of humor, and she absolutely drove the work I'm going to describe today in the field in terms of getting people out of the laboratory and into the city and asking questions about real world behavior and everyday behavior. That's the formal picture. At the top on the left, you can see a photograph of Eleanor's head from behind. This was taken in 2004. And it's hard to see me. There's a face right at the top. I'm in the middle of that wearing a tie. I used to turn up to work in ties back then. On the right of me, very hard to make out, is Darshan Kumaran, the vice president of Google DeepMind. Not in shot was a guy back in 2004 who kept going on and on about AI. AI is going to be amazing. And everyone looked at him as if, yeah, sure. There's been a big AI winter. Nobody's really interested in AI. It turned out he was definitely on the money, because that was Demis Hassabis, who then got bought out by Google to set up Google DeepMind. But back then, what we were doing in this study, this first one I'll introduce, was we'd seen Sony spend I think it was £2 million recreating lavishly central London in an immersive environment for a brutal and horrific video game called The Getaway. It was brutal, and it was a lot of just going around killing gangsters and being shot at and driving cars. You could drive a taxi in this game. I don't have footage of the game to show now. It's a bit hard on here to see, but you could drive a taxi around London. So what we thought we'd do was to put people inside the MRI scanner and scan them driving around a virtual simulation of London. Except we couldn't program it. So we had 6 PlayStations all bought on a grant, all connected to each other, jumping around bits of London, whilst in this case London taxi drivers drove London taxis around London. And the example in the other photographs, here's the scanner. They needed to rebuild the device to play the video game entirely out of plastic so that it could go through a metal detector and not kill the taxi drivers if you just took a standard device. There was a lot going on in that experiment I won't go into, but the upshot of what Eleanor, the innovation she had, was to say, how are we going to analyze this behavior, the activity in their brains, in this like 30 minutes of driving through a city? And her suggestion in a stairwell to me at one point was, just ask them. Ask them what they were thinking. And I remember thinking, what? You can't do that. That's not how psychology works. You test people, you get reaction times out, and you get button presses. But what she had suggested was, if you get them to drive through London, it's quite salient. And if you hit a lamppost or you get shot at or whatever happens in the video game, hopefully they get to where we're asking them to go, they'll tell you the key moments in that, and then you can analyze it. And the images here are exactly that. They are moments when taxi drivers had to replan their route, deal with new instructions, and look out into the world for things they were waiting to see. So from that study, we were able to analyze what's going on inside the brains of London taxi drivers in a real-world environment that's, in this case, simulated lavishly at £2 million, but not programmable. So that's just an intro, and I wanted to thank Eleanor for everything today. What I'd like to do briefly is just show the gallery of faces of the people who are involved in the research I'm going to talk about today. A whole range of colleagues, of different levels. The people I'm going to mention at the beginning at the top are Antoine Coutreau and Michael Hornberger, who are instrumental in the work I'm about to show you, where we did have control. We could program a virtual environment and do something. And Michael Hornberger came to me one day, I think it was a phone call, said, I've got a very strange request. Somebody wants a one-pager, and they won't tell us who they are, for a research project. So we filled out the project request. We had the idea of, let's create a video game that could be really useful as a diagnostic tool for Alzheimer's, because if it could test navigation very carefully, which is a core symptom in early Alzheimer's disease, we'd have something really useful. And that disappeared, that one-pager. Maybe a couple of months later, we got an email saying, congratulations, you've been awarded the money. It's unlimited. There's no budget, it's just, you can just go do it. And what that then meant, it wasn't unlimited, there was a limit on the budget, but it was towards $12 million basically got spent on the project I'm going to talk about. Most of that $12 million was on advertising. Because as Matthias said, sometimes in the research I'm about to present, it wasn't just one person we tested, or 2 or 3 or 4. In this case, it was 4 million people. To recruit 4 million people, you need a lot of advertising revenue. In this case, the mysterious company turned out to be Deutsche Telekom, who just wanted to put 1/4 of their year's advertising money into this, which was $12 million. So what did we do with that money, though? This is the bit where it gets more interesting. We built a video game called See Your Request. And I say we, I mean the money allowed us to hire in a company at $1 million to spend 2 years building, or a year at high speed, a video game. And the company that built it were a company called Glitchers, who'd had previous small-scale successes. And we picked them because they were very clear on what they wanted to do. And the idea they had as a way of testing navigation was to put people in a boat. on the ocean and test their navigation around. And the reason I like this is that a lot of video games, like the taxi drivers driving around London, is you collide with walls and it's very frustrating. You can't do what you're expecting to do. If I have to get in a real boat, it's hard to control it, and so the virtual world we created is consistent with that feeling of it being more difficult. Crucially, you can see where you can and can't go because of the water. So this is the supplementary material showing the game from our first manuscript. People see a map of locations to go to. They close the map, and then they control this little boat by tapping left or right on the touch screen. The whole time this little boat is moving around, it's tracking inside their phone the GPS in the virtual world of where that boat is. And they can upgrade the boat when they win stars and so on. It's really massively gamified to get towards 4 million people. But this is a very good participant because they're taking a very efficient route to the different points in the space. And this is one level out of 75 game levels built by the company. There were a number of different tasks. We had this wayfinding task where they get feedback telling them they were amazing and they nailed it. And from there, I'll just jump onto the next slide now. Yeah, here we go. So with that, here's some other shots of different levels. So we have the Arctic rivers environment, we had tropical oceans, and we had rough rolling seas and some marshes. So a whole lot of different themed environments to engage people. But what that allowed us to do was to have anyone in the world download the app for free, play this video game, upload the data, and crucially demographic information. How old were they? Were they left or right-handed? How much education did they have? Which country are they from? And a number of other factors to kind of understand what do we need to do to benchmark. If we want somebody to come into a clinic with this, how old are they? Are they male or female? Are they from Nigeria? What is it we can do? And the idea here was to get enough data. We hope we get, after a year, 10,000 people, because the previous group had done that. Within 2 days, we'd had 10,000 people go and log in and generate data. I'm not going to show you in this map 4 million people, because that's what we ended up with. I'll just sound sample this to 100 people. And I'm going to show you 100 people in this map next. They're all going to appear as little dots moving from the start to 3 different checkpoints in our wayfinding task. And the crucial thing is these 400 people are exactly the same age, exactly the same gender, exactly the same location, country, they're exactly the same handle, they're exactly the same on lots and lots of variables. They're the same. One red dot is the same for all those people and all those demographics, except that person has a clinical issue where they get lost every single day at work. They grew up with hydrocephalus, and we're trying to help as an example of one of a number of conditions where we're interested. So without further ado, you'll start to see at the bottom there, the little blue dots travel out through the map. Again, this is a tiny sample of our 4 million participants. And you can see the red dot in there is very consistent with the others. And it's real world, everyday behavior in the sense of people aren't just in a lab. Some people go back, some people go wrong. The red dot is one of those people that goes wrong early. As time goes forward, you see more and more diversity in the data. And you can see how rich this data is. And I would say we've spent 8 years trying to use AI to accelerate the analysis of that. And 2 weeks ago, there was a breakthrough in terms of how you can decode and extract information from this. And we've found there are very intricate, very specific clusters. You can't see them by eye, and you can't see them in 100 people, but they exist. We haven't reported that yet, but that's one of the publications we hope to add to the long list. In terms of everyday behavior, what we've importantly done with this is to not just assume this is good at testing navigation. We took people out into Covent Garden and in the Montmartre area of Paris to test their real-world navigation on a real task with GPS tracking. And we find that that correlates very well with the game performance when the game requires you to navigate. We find that's true in older individuals as well, but more specific to certain levels of very good at that, certain bits of the game. So we know it has real-world validity, but requires a bit of care. Let me go through some of the key demographic discoveries we made with this. One of the first things we did was to use linear models and linear mixed models to look at who in the world, where is the population in the world, given we've got 4 million people, with the best navigators. There's obviously countries with the worst navigators, but I'll focus on the good ones for being sensitive. You can also see, crucially, when I present this map, although we tested 4 million people, the whole swathes of sub-Saharan Africa and Northern Africa are not sampled sufficiently for us to be confident. We may have 400 people from Kenya, but that's not enough to be able to estimate how they perform globally. all the other countries we have large populations from. And what we discovered, as you can see in that top right zoom in on Europe, is that Finnish people happen to be the best, at least in 2016, at navigating. I don't know if there's anyone from Finland in the room, but they can be very smug if they are. The second best was Sweden. These two countries compete quite a lot with each other, so they were kind of frustrated, the Swedes, to miss out on being the top. But Sweden, Finland, and Norway at school actually train people to navigate. They get classes in how to do orienteering, and they actually compete internationally alongside 11 other countries. And we found that the game data from this could predict from the population level of how well Finland, Sweden, Norway do in the game, how many medals they've won historically at these international competitions. So the game has both real-world validity, testing people in the real world, but it can predict real-world features like international medal rankings. Okay, and there are other countries that are not so good. The major factor that defines the red to less red areas is GDP. So the data, when I started running this study, I suddenly realized how much our social environment, in terms of our financial environment around us, the environment we live in. Boston's a fantastic example. Boston here, many people are supported to be cognitively good. There are other places in the world, but that's just not the case. And so there are, our cognition is affected by the GDP of the country we sit in. Okay, so that was the basic one of the key findings. We also found that on average, men were slightly better at the game. There's a male advantage, and that as people got older, they got worse on average in terms of a cross-sectional assessment. So people in their 70s are worse than people in their 20s. We've not done a cross-time analysis to know, do people get worse? But from a cross-sectional analysis, I'm going to show you that in a second. I'm going to show you how age and gender separate in the data. But one of the key questions I decided to ask in this research project was, does it matter if you grew up in, say, Boston, like a big dense city, or outside of Boston, somewhere in the countryside, in a rural setting? Does it matter? Because in some ways, cities are really complicated places to find your way, but rural environments are much more diverse. There's much longer distances you might have to travel. So is there a benefit of growing up in cities, or which way is it? We found very strongly across every country in the world we looked at, there was a negative effect of growing up in cities. And that's what this chart is showing here. So on the y-axis, going up and down, is the population level performance at wayfinding. And on the x-axis is age, so from early 20s through to 70s. What you're seeing there is that people get worse with age. There's a pretty near linear decline as we get older. So after you leave your 20s, you're getting worse and worse at navigating in our test. And you can see there's a separation by gender. That's a bit harder to see. It's not indicated on here, but the top two lines are male and the bottom two lines are female. Countries like Finland, there's very little difference between men and women, and there's a big difference in, say, Iran and Lebanon and other countries. And we can predict that gap between men and women by international metrics in terms of gender equality. And that's another whole story from this research. But here, the big point I would make is that the gray line and the green line is whether you grew up in cities. They separate out such that if you look at the far right of the map, a woman who grew up in a rural environment has a 10-year cognitive advantage over a woman who grew up in a city. So it's not negligibly small, it's quite substantial. That's the average in the world. For some countries, there's an even bigger difference in effect. So why is that? Why do cities have a negative impact on our testing in our game? And we, at this point, discovered a work by Jeff Boeing, who published a geography paper where he quantified every single city in the world in terms of how, what the entropy of the streets were. So his measure of entropy was if you took Boston, for example, slightly misaligned in bits, but Chicago sure isn't. If people have been to Chicago, I imagine many of you had, it's super gritty. Whereas, say, Prague is pretty mid there. But if we look down, this is every city. You can't see the labels because of the size of the screen, but down in the bottom right there is Rome. And if anybody's been to Rome, none of the streets align. It's just chaotic. Sao Paulo is similar. So what that meant for us is we could take every city in the world, and then we can work out for every country like Czechoslovakia, how gritty are their cities? How gritty are American cities? How gritty are UK cities? And what we've done in this chart is to plot on the y-axis here that grittiness. So a low score like 2.4 is Chicago. So a country with cities like, you're going to see America, United States is quite low on this y-axis. whereas Ireland has the most wiggly streets in the world, and they're at the top. On the x-axis, going left to right, is the effect size of growing up in a city. The further to the right the country is, the more the negative effect of cities are. And we found a very striking linear correlation between these, a negative correlation. So the Argentina, for example, has the strongest negative effect of growing up, say, in Buenos Aires versus the outside. United States is there, Canada's there, but it lines up, there's a linear effect of that. So what that implied to us is that it's the grittiness of cities. It's not just cities, it's not, somebody did write me a handwritten letter saying, I think it's fluoride that's causing this. It's not, as far as we know. It's more likely the grittiness. At least the editor and the reviewers we had at Nature agree with that, not the fluoride hypothesis. But you can separate out the countries. If I go back, you can, oh, sorry, go back. You can see some, there we go. Some countries are in the right-hand cluster really quite gritty, like the United States and Argentina. Other countries like Ireland and Czechoslovakia are quite non-gritty. So what we're able to do is look at these two different groups of countries and then go back into our video game, because we had 75 levels, and see if it matters the environment people are navigating. So if you look at level 42 on our game, it's a bit like Chicago. It's quite gritty. Whereas level 68, it's like Rome. It's all over the place. And so what we found then when we looked in more detail, and so I'll explain this graph, is along the bottom x-axis, the game level entropy is how gritty is the level, with the far left, 2.4 being the one on the far left being very gritty, like Chicago, and the one on the far right being like Rome. On the y-axis going up and down is the negative effect of cities. And what we found is a very steep curve, so people get much, much worse. They're very, very sensitive to the game grittiness if they grew up in the United States or Argentina or other gritty countries. And actually what we see in this graph is that if you grew up in the United States, you actually go below the line and you've got a slight non-statistically significant advantage navigating gritty environments. One way to read this graph is if you've got someone from Boston, let's say, and someone from Dublin, and you both go to Buenos Aires, which is very gritty, ask the person from Boston which way to go. They might have a tiny, tiny advantage. But if you have to go somewhere really wild like Sao Paulo, go for the person from Dublin. So that's what that is telling us, that they're more sensitive to the level. I should add finally, before I move on to the next story, that it doesn't matter where you live now. We ran a whole bunch of follow-up studies. It doesn't matter where you live now, it's where you grew up. And it doesn't matter that it's a video game involving C. We re-simulated the entire task at the request of a reviewer in a cityscape with a car. Exactly the same effect sizes, same sort of patterns in the data. So there's a lot packed into that paper to kind of explore. But now I'm going to turn to a totally different group, because what I've been talking about so far is 4 million people spread all over the world in different countries. And it assumes we're all homogenous, that everyone in Boston is the same. But we're not, of course. And in particularly, this guy is not. He's from the same city I work in. This is Graham Greenlass, and he is a London taxi driver standing next to his London taxi. He's exactly the kind of man that Ellen and McGuire scanned many, many years ago to discover that his posterior hippocampus was in fact larger than non-taxi drivers, and as I found working with, larger than bus drivers who also have to drive around London. Graham's brain is very interesting, but what I felt like with the work was that we'd never really exploited in all the research on time. There are maybe 20 papers on London taxi drivers. What I'm going to present now is work where I was digging into the really unique skill they have, which is if you give them a starting point and a destination, to get the badge he has around his neck, called a green badge, he has to be able to rattle out and tell you every single street between those two places on a straight line. And if he doesn't do it, they tell him to leave immediately and not show his face again for a while to get the badge. It's called doing the knowledge exam. It's horrendous. People fail 16 times on average, because if I say to anyone now who knows London, can you go from Piccadilly Circus to King's Cross Station? You might be able to do it, but can you take all of the side streets needed to get there? He had to do that. So that means we've got a group of people that can tell you, if they plan out a route over 26,000 streets, the exact journey they will take. And 26,000 factorial is a very, very large number. The number of possible combinations of streets is larger than the number of stars in our universe, in our galaxy at least. What we did with Graham, and well, not Graham himself, but a group of 40 taxi drivers, was just to give them a destination, a starting location, and say, tell us every street. And my interest in this is that if you do that, some of the streets, they will just tell you the entire sequence of streets rapidly, and others, they will pause and scratch their head and think about it, and then tell you the sequence. And the question of scientists is why? Why does he pause for so long on some corners and others are really quick? It's hard to see this. You won't be able to make out the background. It's all dark there. But you have to believe me that there is a network of streets in London laid out. What I think you can see are little yellow dots flipping their way through that street network over the and this runs really over maybe something like 10 kilometers of distance through the space. Those little dots are given in, I think, near or either real or in near real time of 20 or 40 taxi drivers imagining their journey through London step by step. And again, what you'll see is sometimes they're really quick, and at other points they really pause to think about it. And they're quite consistent in that. If there's a hard turn on Shaftesbury Avenue, they'll all pause and think about it. So the question was, why? We collected the data from this called the call out, and we analyzed it in two different ways. And here's that journey plotted now with the lines connecting all the routes. Some of them are very direct. I'm not sure I'd want to be in the taxi going on the right-hand side. I'd probably charge another $10 extra to my journey. But the routes through the middle, you can see these big circles are how long they're taking to think about it. So why is that one in the middle there so big? And what we did was to take a number of parameters about that journey and work out, do any of them affect the response time? And what we found is, if we start on this graph, so this is the log of reaction times in our model we're fitting. And really we found that the number of streets ahead to the end has no effect. It's significant, but if you've got 30 streets to plan ahead, it doesn't affect taxi drivers. And that's one of the key results. They are certainly using hierarchical compression. They're not doing a breadth-first search through all the possible streets. If they were, they'd be really slow at the first. But what we did find is if they have to mentally turn across streets, they're slow. And if they get onto a main road with many, many options on it, with high betweenness centrality, if you know graph theory, then they'll be very slow. But if they hit a core boundary in the network, that's where you might, like where you're going into Soho or out of Soho, they're quick, they're fast. Again, this data implies that they're using the boundaries that taxi drivers like to think about to speed up their planning process. Digging in more detail, in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this year, we published a paper. We used computational models of planning to go deeper into it. What are the parameters that actually define, not just boundaries or streets? And what we found was that the time they spend to scratch their chin and think at the beginning really affects the way in which they process the streets. So what we're looking at here, you've got four sets. On the y-axis here is the call out speed, like how many seconds they're taking to respond. You can see that below their average speed is like about 1.8 seconds to get each street out. And what we're seeing is an effect of the local transition entropy. So what is the possible number of like how much disorganization is there in the street structure around the point you're deciding? If it's very narrow and there's only a few ways you can go, then they'll be quite quick. But if it's disorganized, then they'll take longer to think about it. But crucially, the taxi drivers, let's imagine that was Graham, who was quite good at thinking about the route in advance, and that's the right-hand paragraphs. They are much more efficient and fast if they do that to process those streets with this higher local transition entropy. So this data highlights the value of thinking before you act if you're going to plan a route. And there's a lot more packed into that paper, but I'm going to get to the end of this talk sooner. So do go and have a look at this paper we published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I'm going to shift now to brain activity and a real-world environment. And instead of looking just at the planning process, I'm interested in what happens as you navigate. If you leave this building and you go to somewhere else, what's happening in your brain? And for this particular study, we're interested in graph theoretic measures. So this one is a measure of the closeness centrality of every street. If you can make out this street network, this is central London. So the River Thames is the big black line running through the middle there. There are some bridges crossing over it. And the red lines here streets in central London that are really connected so that they're close in the graph structure in terms of how you can move from one street to another to many other streets. So Oxford Street, if people know London, is highly connected to lots of other streets, for example. Whereas these South London streets that taxi drivers like to avoid, they're very non-connected to the network. I'm telling you all of this because in the little outline there in white is a bit of London in the middle of North Soho, where we took 26 participants who had never been there before and took them on a really detailed 2-hour tour on foot, pointing out 26 different bars and cafes and jazz bars that they needed to memorize, think about, and tell us, like a taxi driver afterwards, how they can get there. Next day, we put them, each of them, after they'd done that, into our MRI scanner, and they watched high-definition film footage of traveling through those streets, snaking their way along new routes they'd never taken before. So they'd walked all the streets, but they'd never quite taken the new route they were given. And there were two different things they had to do. One was easy. It was just, there's a sat-nav, and you just follow the instruction. When you get to a junction, if it says turn left, you turn left. In the other condition, they had to choose from their memory which way to go. And so we're interested in seeing whether these graph theoretic measures affect their brain. Is somewhere in their brain representing information about the structure of London? And again, you can expand this to Boston if you want. But that's one. This is between the centrality, which is if you went from any one street to any other, how often would you go through that street? So bridges, for example, have high between the centrality measures. So close to centrality, this is how connected a street is to the rest of the streets. Between this is how much you tend to go through them. And the final graph theoretic measure interesting is just how connected is a given street to other streets. So 7 Dials, for example, in London has 6 different streets, and it's highly connected locally. And you can see there are some central London streets in Soho, really not dead ends, for example, where there's nowhere else you can go. So do any of these measures affect your brain when you're navigating a city? And if so, which? So to do that, here's an example of one route. This is a view it's an axiometric projection of the street structure in northern Soho. On the far right side is Soho Square, and the street running up the middle is Oxford Street, covered in shoe shops and many other brightly colored shops. But in the middle here, you can see a route snaking its way through is one of the routes at about 6 streets. And what we can do is map onto that route these different graph theoretic measures. And what we can then do is look at the changes that occur with those, and then we can look at brain activity. And what we found, to our delight in this case, our theoretical prediction, is that the hippocampus, the bit that's larger in London taxi drivers, is responsive. It's more active when the degree centrality connections go up. There's more options, and it goes down if you go into a dead end where there are less options. And what we found, crucially, and this made all these headlines in newspapers, was that that's only true when you're thinking about it. If you're running a sat-nav, there's no correlation. So not a huge surprise to cognitive scientists, but a revelation to many people of like, wow, if I don't have to think about it, then my brain isn't doing anything. That's right. But what we found, and when we look at that contrast, like what's more active when you're thinking about it, navigating versus sat-nav, the only part of the brain that was active was the posterior right hippocampus, a bit of the brain that correlates with years of experience of being a taxi driver in terms of its size. So we also found that when you take the entire journey into account, it's not just the whole time. I find this particular graph really interesting for today's conference because this is a journey through real streets, pretty dirty streets in London, to be honest. But it's showing that that activity pattern is not occurring all the way along the journey. It's not when you're traveling down a street. It's not when you're making a decision. It's the moment you step into, that when I stepped into this room and I could see there's not many ways out, my hippocampal activity from this data may have gone down. So it's showing us which part of the brain, what information is being represented, and where in a navigation, everyday experience, is it being engaged? And that's kind of useful for thinking about how might you use brain activity to help you think about designing spaces, and for clinical interventions where you think, what's happening for this person? When are they needing to engage certain bits of their brain in everyday experience? And our results showed the hippocampus, the posterior part, was really only interested in local connections, whereas the anterior hippocampus was more interested in the global connections, which fits with some other data from John O'Keefe and other people who won Nobel Prizes on animal work, but something we'd like to replicate to be more confident about. But that last result kind of means that if it likes the global connectedness, you can take Manhattan and you can plot out where in Manhattan would your anterior hippocampus be most excited. And it's kind of like lower Manhattan. And in Warsaw, in Lisbon, where is it most excited? And where in Warsaw is it most excited? So you can start to take these data and map them into real world. The final thing from this study we found was that you can also look at how people plan their route ahead. So in our journey through the streets, they had to make decisions, and sometimes they were given detours to take, which is annoying. You have to take an alternative route. And we found that sometimes those detours in the paths ahead had a lower demand. You didn't have to think much, but sometimes there was more streets you needed to think about in the future. And that the more streets you had in the future to think about, the more there was activity in the lateral prefrontal cortex. You can see that I highlighted there pretty selectively in the human brain. And this result I quite like because one reviewer number 5, I think, suggested this. It wasn't our idea, and a very nice example of scientific publishing working well with a very good reviewer suggesting an idea. But this part of the brain, if you were to lose your prefrontal cortex, it's very likely you'd make very bad plans, traveling across a city, but also picking out what clothes you might want to wear that day. So now I'm just going to move on to a new study that has been resubmitted for, should be accepted soon, we hope. We had a previous psychological experiment looking at this, but our new imaging study is hopefully going to be out soon, which is that to take people on tours with YouTube in our MRI scanner around different places. So they'd never been to these locations. In Soho, we trained them. They knew the streets. In this new study, they've never visited these places before. I'm interested in their exposure. There's 2 videos are showing here, one at the top and one. They only saw one movie at a time in the MRI scanner. And I'm showing these 2 movies side by side because the top movie that people are being exposed to lying in our MRI scanner is very complicated. That is a very complex multi-story building with many view, unusual space. This bottom one is visually complex. There's a lot visually going on, but it's just 2 rooms. There's nothing really, going back to that complexity graph theoretic measures, there's nothing happening there. And in this study, we were looking at aesthetics, which I won't talk about today because the top one's not so nice and this bottom one's nicer. Even the toilet's clean in this example. But we had about 70 different movies. Some of them were pretty horrible, and some of them were really expensive and lovely. And we were looking at that. But here I'm focusing on, for the link to the previous study, is the complexity. And what we found, I line up all these movies from the most complicated to the simplest, which was a tunnel, was that the activity occurred in the hippocampus, the parahippocampus, and the retrosplenial cortex, brain areas we've known about for 20 years that are crucial for navigation and finding your way, showing that if you just take the complexity of a space, you can predict brain activity. We're now going to be diving into that data, that experience of spaces, to understand more about computational aspects of rooms and spaces. We just haven't, this first paper is very, very simple. What we did find with this, though, was that complexity drives all these spatial areas of the brain, but the memory for spaces really goes to the hippocampus and the parahippocampus, shown in these images here. So if I see a space like this, which is a short snippet of something that people generally remembered well, it will have more activity. This replicates work going back to the 1990s, but here we're doing it for architectural spaces. Thank you. So the last bit in 10 minutes I've got left is to say the real world out there is rich, really rich. You can look out the window, but here's Piccadilly Circus. There's a lot of people. And what we thought we'd do in London was to explore how people navigate when it's crowded. We wanted to try, and we didn't want to do it in virtual reality. We wanted to do it for real. So in London, we're fortunate to have the People Environment Activity Research Lab with 4,000 square meters of modifiable space that's precision built for engineering. And inside it, we built our own art gallery with giant theatrical curtains with a view to the 10-meter high ceiling with cameras all fitted and tracking systems. And then we invited 100 people in to wear QR-coded hats so we could track them, fitted with tracking devices, ultra-wideband. And here's, in a pilot we did, 30 people, but in the experiment we had 100 people all go and explore, navigate, and do various other tasks in this space. We also had EEG to test mobile EEG on 3 of the people, and on 7 people we had eye tracking systems. And there was other bits of instrumentation. We also had some FNIRs. So the tech that's come into the room is really exciting for what we can do with the data. It's a psychology experiment as well. So I could have done all of that without mocking up a gallery here or in London or somewhere. But with this experiment, everybody signed ethical consent to be watched, and they all filled out a survey about their background. Did they grow up in a city or not a city? And how did they feel about the experiences we threw them through? This is the eye tracking. I'm only going to briefly show of somebody. Oh, maybe we can turn off the audio if that's okay. Because it's okay. We can have the audio. It's just it's distracting to hear. But you can see this person entering into the maze, and where they're looking around. This is someone coming in. It's a crowded space. They spend a lot of time looking at faces, unsurprisingly. We've got 2 PhD students arriving in a month to spend each of them 4 years analyzing this data, the eye tracking data, but also the spatial data. It's extremely rich data, and we're going to be spending quite a bit of time analyzing it. The art gallery had 12 different screens. They had a task of going. There's a lot going on in this experiment. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is the data from 100 people's ultra-wideband trackers that were sitting next to their head as they walked around. We also had footage capturing their heads from above, looking at those QR-coded hats. You can see people starting to line up, ready to be launched into our space. You can see the different rooms. You can see screens people had to locate. In this particular bit, they're just going to be exploring. So I'm quite interested in taking reinforcement learning models and seeing, can I predict the way in which these people will behave? But go beyond that into the everyday experience of crowded spaces and look at the crowd. Is there emergent behavior appearing from the way people interact? Crucially, I would add, is because this is an engineering facility, we can go back and do this again. It's not central Boston, it's a lab. We can take another 100 people and say, does it replicate exactly? We could take one person and say, are they on their own? Are they better when there's not 99 people around them? Or are they worse? So there's a lot we can do. You can see them now walking, exploring the space. So here they're just going around and exploring. Again, it will be fascinating to look at reinforcement learning models to see, can they predict where people go, why they go to where they go, why do they start to cluster? This is extremely rich data we're working with, but extends away from the work I was showing before with movies into the real world. This is the second, if I play this. So because it was under our control, in that first part of the experiment, we could knock a hole through a wall, create a shortcut, and see how people adapted, and see if these reinforcement learning models that deal with adaptation fit people's behavior very well. But here, shown in this movie, we could also take time to just knock everything to open plan and look at what happens in a very large open space. And now here's people re-entering the space. And in this particular movie, again, for time I won't show it, but everyone was entering into the space. They were engaging in a social task of finding people. And crucially, for a new line of research I'm interested in, we had them do fire evacuation. So as you can see from my previous work, I've mainly focused on how people find their way to a bar. That's often what we've done. Here, we wanted to look at how people, once an alarm goes off, how do people behave? And I can tell you, out of 100 people, I think 11 people did the right thing. They went to the exit that was next to them. Everyone else went back the way they came. And with the eye tracking, it's fascinating to see if you're in the middle of a dense crowd and you can see the exit, but 11 large men turn around and start walking at you, it's not efficient to go to the exit because you'll have to fight your way through this crowd of people to do it. So as soon as you get a kind of avalanche of people starting to do that, and that's a known phenomenon in that field, but here we'll be able to look at all the demographics in utter detail in the way you never do in those experiments. So yeah, you can see people gathering here now, and I won't show the end of the movie where they all suddenly disperse, and they should go to the front two exits, but they don't. I said really rich data. And here's some 2-camera bits of footage where they're dispersed in the space, and here they're all gathered, and it's from that point we did this. So we've got a lot of data. We're very welcome to share it. If anyone in the audience wants to work with the data we have, we're not people that hold our data and hide it away. We're very keen to collaborate if anyone wants to look at this data or do things with it. It's going to be made freely available. It's just complicated data. Okay, and this is where we've got to a little bit, just to give one snippet of the kind of things we can do with the analysis. Because we asked everyone, how stressed did you feel coming out of that on a scale, we can see whether that matters. Does that affect the data? And what we found, the data is presented by a student here, stress is on a 10-point scale going left to right, and the score going up and down on the y-axis of these two graphs is how much, in this case, people occupied the space, the distribution of how much they spread out in the space. And what the analysis found was that on the right-hand side, sorry, the middle graphs show people who reported being highly stressed, and they, we found, were more focal in their distribution in the space. People who were not stressed, quite happy with the experience, covered a wider range. So we will be digging into that in a lot more detail, but it seems possible that the way in which people move can maybe predict emotional experiences that people have. Okay, whoops. So I said cities and oceans, back to oceans, because cities are really interesting. I've been studying them for a while, but we've now, in the last 4 years, started a project to look at the right-hand side. Sea request was all on water. You know, we found all this amazing data from sea request, but there are people in fascinating places. On the far left, there's a little mark, and that's Hawaii. I'll come back to why that's interesting. But people in Hawaii, you know, they don't really feature in our data very much. I'll come into them. But on the ocean, that's when things get really hard to navigate. You kind of have to use GPS out there on the ocean waves. But not everybody. So I got an email just before the pandemic hit from a researcher called Maria Ahmed. I'll show her in a moment. Saying hello, as a short Gmail email saying, hi, I live in the Marshall Islands, which I had to look up, and there it is on the Earth on the far side, right? There's a zoomed-in map of the Marshall Islands. It's a huge area. It's bigger than you can see from the windows out of here. Vast amount of space. But like, you know, most of the capital city might fit inside this building. These are tiny atolls in the Marshall Islands where they're just strips of land. And so you can see the map there. Here's a group of people living on the Marshall Islands, a family, with the ocean waves behind them. And Maria contacted me, Maria Ahmed, because she'd begun to realize, like I said, on the open ocean it's hard to navigate, and they have canoe builders there who started to build canoes like the old days. This is a 1940s photograph, and they have now built canoes. What we are going to do, and the interest I have, I'll tell you in a moment, what we're going to do is that what fascinates me about the Marshallese is that in the ancient past, and there's still some today, they built what are called stick charts. I don't know if anyone in the room has come across stick charts before. No, okay, so there are not lots of hands up, or maybe somebody's there but shy. Stick charts are fascinating because they are a map of space. The stick chart is each of the little dots is a shell, a little tiny cowrie shell, and they represent the islands. So it gives this kind of geographic, large-scale, you know, many thousands of miles space in a stick, held by someone on a beach. You know, in 1809 is when they first started collecting these. But what is interesting is that the sticks represent not just the connections between the islands, but the swells, the waves that connect them. And what the Marshallese would have done for thousands of years is to use these stick charts to learn and understand, if I'm going from one atoll to another, what is the swell pattern I'm going to feel in the dark as I go on my canoe, like this. And crucially, the really exciting thing for me as a scientist is, thank you, that they can feel the reflections and refractions of the atolls 60 kilometers away in the dark, blindfold. It's like a superpower. With that power of feeling things like I can see, like it's the MIT building, you know, I could feel that far, far away in the dark. They were able to colonize these islands and navigate. But that art has sadly died. But with the last known navigator, this is my last slide, Alison Kellen, who's here. This is Maria Ahmed. That's me. And anthropologist Joe Gentz, who spent his entire career in the Marshall Islands studying the Marshallese. In 2 days' time, I'm going to be on that yacht with Maria. Alison and Joe are going to be on beach telling us what to do. But we're going to be taking a yacht and going from the capital city, Majuro, down in the bottom shown there, and sailing to the atoll of Aur. And that whole way we're going on that direction, we'll be collecting data from the indigenous sailors there and from the team as to where they think they are, like an internal ping on everyone's GPS, the entire route out and the entire route back, to understand how do people make use of these ocean swells and waves on the ocean, and 0 seconds. So in a couple of days' time, I will know the answer, but I don't yet know. I've got I come with a carrier bag today because my rucksack is completely full of equipment to kit out this boat with sensors and EEG systems to put on people. So hopefully we'll find some really interesting everyday behavior from these Marshallese sailors. So a big thanks to the team that have made all I've been describing possible, and thank you for listening to this talk. I hope you found it interesting.
All right, thank you so much for this exciting talk. I'm sure we have like a million questions, so if you have a question, ideally maybe join me here at the microphone. Yeah, and please say a few words about who you are.
Hi, Hugo. Thank you for this beautiful talk. My name is Alex. I'm from TU Berlin. I'm doing FNews and EEG, wearable neuroscience. I'm almost afraid to ask a question that probably you're going to get asked every time, probably also by reviewers. So you mentioned the sat-nav, and I'm really curious about what you might have found across generations, use of mobile phones, and the lack of or the loss of skill and maybe brain matter, I don't know, in terms of navigation. So I'm really
this is a big one. I have another PhD student, Juliette Dupichui, who's working on this exact problem of how is the use of GPS affecting people, and to really look at that question of does not using GPS damage your brain? Is the kind of core simple question. It's very hard to run a really powered study to do that, so it's very hard to know. Undoubtedly, there is a change. The most interesting study I've seen related to this in the last years was an article in the BMJ last Christmas, showing that when they looked at 8 million death records in the United States, taxi drivers and ambulance drivers were the least likely statistically to die from Alzheimer's. And then when they did a number of corrections and downsampled and did things, they found they could reliably, robustly find that effect. That's interesting because it suggests that, yeah, if you do a profession that does require you to think about navigating a lot, it may be preventative of Alzheimer's potentially. But claiming that is very hard to do. So we don't yet know. But that project in the waves is kind of hopefully reactivating people's interest in sat-nav-based navigation. Yeah, but great question, yeah.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I'm Aiden from Northeastern University. I'm a student. I was wondering if you've looked at like other psychological tests and what similarities and differences you've seen, and what are the most similar tasks to navigation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just preface to that one as well is to say navigation varies a lot. So, and in fact, when you do test people's navigation, you give them a self-survey about how well they think they navigate. They're often not that correlated. Some people think they're amazing, and they're not. But what we found in some previous work we published last year is that, for example, visual spatial tasks, like how you can align objects in space, they're quite predictive of, say, sea request. In a way, I was surprised. So I think there's still a bit of a journey to do, but things like mental rotation tasks can kind of show results. So there's an ongoing question about how is navigation related to other tasks, and it's made difficult by the fact navigation is quite diverse, but it's a great question. Yeah.
Hi, Kate from University of Leeds. I look at EEG in classrooms. Thank you for the talk, by the way. You were really clear, and I really appreciate when people can take you segmentally along a talk. My questions are around, have you looked at how people process errors, and if it even maps as an error in the brain? If a taxi driver takes a turn, for example, do they consider that an error, and how long does it take for them to recalibrate? And then also to do with consistency. So if you were to ask those taxi drivers to then take go from Piccadilly to, King's Cross, do they take the same route every time, and how does that differ in the brain?
Oh, that's great. So we haven't done that. It would be interesting to know. They suspect they might do that, but it might not. It's unclear. Error pattern's really interesting. With the taxi drivers, in that original study I started with, they would say, yeah, I made an error there, and we could see a very strong right lateral response in their brain. In a follow-up study, we looked at people backtracking, and yeah, when people, as in you're going down a path, you turn around and go, you can see a large response again in prefrontal regions, and particularly the anterior cingulate in navigation when people make errors. But there's more to do. But yeah, there's not been studied enough, I think, the error patterns that people make and what happens. So it's something we need to do more of. Thank you for the questions.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. Catherine Mickelson, Smith College. I was curious about the role of landmarks and how that may, especially, and I was very surprised by your city navigation versus non-city, and if kind of landmarks might explain some of that and how that interacts with kind of the simple versus complex environments with object processing.
Yeah, you're right. Landmarks are really important for navigating in many scenarios. I think the ones I've looked at here, you know, we haven't done enough. So the movie I showed of the two complex and simple spaces, that's exactly right. We're going to start looking at landmarks and how they're represented. And we've got eye tracking on these people to have a look at what did they do. So we need to explore that. Great question. I'll carry on with the questions, yeah, if that's okay.
Thank you for that inspirational talk and for the amazing data you presented on the millions of people who participated in your online task. I'm wondering, how confident are you that the people who took the task were who they said they were? And how did you know what their backgrounds were, you know, where they grew up before they took the test? It's great to have large numbers. It's a little bit daunting to verify and validate who actually is taking the test.
Yeah.
Connectivity is another issue.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think what this study helped us spot is when you've got that amount of data, you can spot patterns in it of kind of what you might think is like faking and stuff. So we found over the age of 70, there are sort of strange patterns in the data. As to why that is, I don't know. I've got a short amount of time left to finish these questions. So yeah, we are careful, and we comment in some of the papers about the care needed to do that. With the paper, we looked at cities versus non-cities. We went and studied 1,000 new people and replicated the exact same patterns where they could tell us exactly which city they lived in. Maybe they were lying again, but it's a bit harder to then go in and say, yeah, I lived in Chicago growing up, and oh, I lived in Los Angeles. It seems less likely they were lying, but at some point you have to kind of go, you know, one thing you can look at with this data, just to quickly end on, is like, how many people in the Vatican did the study? And my memory is something like 500 people in the Vatican did the study. And that gives you some sense, because there's only 251 people that live in the Vatican. So we know that double the number. So we have been able to look at the errors and the lack of where you would, you know, be concerned. Because of that, the volumes, though, we think it's reasonably reliable, and we see really robust effects related to social demographics, not just the ones we asked. But great question.
Thank you. Safe travels.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I can't imagine how rich and complex the data is, and how beautiful it is to analyze it. My name's Sung. I'm a PhD student at Dr. Stengel's lab. And my question was, you mentioned that the number of turns changed the reaction times for London taxi drivers, and that kind of hints at this kind of egocentric navigation strategy. Did you take a look at the differences between those two strategies? I can imagine that if people are more used to using sat-nav, then they would be more tuned to using allocentric navigation strategies.
Oh, that's a nice follow-up. We haven't done that experiment. So we could repeat the taxi driver one with non-taxi drivers, because the taxi drivers are so experienced. It did strike me in the early study I did with Eleanor Maguire, when you actually talk to taxi drivers, it's super egocentric for them. When you say King's Cross Station, they'll say, oh, if you say King's Cross Station, for them it's there. You know, they feel it in their body where this is, a bit like these Marshallese sailors, and they picture it in their mind. They see an image in their eye, in their head. And that's also what the Marshallese sailors report. To get to an island, you need to imagine it in your mind. So, but we haven't done that, like that manipulation of whether the reaction times for turns are higher for people who don't like allocentrics. So we could do it. We haven't done it. So it's a nice idea.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. So I think these were all great questions, but we are going to have a break next. Thank you so much again, Hugo, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Very glad to be here.